$1 million. That was the price tag attached to a broken man's life. When Wall Street's most unyielding female billionaire dragged a destitute single father into a sterile courtroom, she expected a swift, decisive victory. She never anticipated the shattering truth that would bring the judge to his knees. Veronica Garcia did not believe in second chances, let alone forgiveness. In the ruthless corridors of Manhattan's commercial real estate market, compassion was a liability, and Veronica had systematically eradicated every liability from her life. At 34, she was the sole founder and CEO of Garcia Holdings, boasting a personal net worth that had recently eclipsed $2 billion. Her legacy was built on glass steel and an ironclad rule: no one makes a mistake on her dime and walks away unpunished. The current thorn in her side was the Astor Heritage Project. It was supposed to be the crown jewel of her portfolio, a glorious $500 million revitalization of a 1920s Gothic cathedral turned luxury commercial hub. But 3 weeks ago, a catastrophic structural failure in the subterranean levels had flooded the electrical grid, halting construction and pushing the launch date back by 6 months. The damages were meticulously calculated by her forensic accountants, exactly $1 million. The fault lay squarely with a minor subcontracting firm that had been brought in to handle the foundation ceiling. "We crush them," Veronica instructed her lead counsel, Richard Lawson, as she stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse office. The city stretched out beneath her like a glittering chessboard. "I want the LLC dissolved, and I want you to pierce the corporate veil. Go after the owner personally. Gross negligence." Richard, a seasoned litigator who usually matched her ruthlessness, hesitated, reviewing the file in his hands. "Veronica, the owner, is a sole proprietor. He's already operating on the margins. If we sue him personally for $1 million, we aren't just bankrupting his business. We are effectively ending his life. His commercial liability insurance lapsed 2 weeks before the accident." Veronica turned her expression as unyielding as marble. "Then he should have paid his premiums. File the injunction, Richard. Set up a mediation purely as a formality, and when he inevitably fails to produce the capital, we take everything he has." Across the East River, in a cramped, drafty apartment in Queens, Nissan Wallace was completely unaware of the legal avalanche hurtling toward him. The alarm clock blared at 4:30 a.m., an abrasive sound that Nissan silenced with a heavy, calloused hand. He sat on the edge of a mattress that had long lost its support, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. At 36, Nissan looked like a man who had carried the weight of the world for far too long. His once bright hazel eyes were perpetually shadowed, and grey, aggressively threaded through his dark hair. "Daddy," a small, sleepy voice murmured from the doorway. Nissan's harsh expression instantly melted. He looked up to see his 7-year-old daughter Chloe clutching a frayed stuffed rabbit, her bare feet shivering on the cheap linoleum floor. "Hey, Bug," Nissan whispered, crossing the room to scoop her up. "It's too early for you. The sun's not even awake yet." "I was cold," she mumbled, burying her face into his neck. Nissan's heart ached with a familiar, suffocating guilt. The building's ancient radiator had failed again. "I know, sweetheart. I'll boil some water for the hot water bottles. Okay, let's get you wrapped up in the big blanket." 3 years ago, Nissan's life had been a modest but happy one. He had a thriving small business and a beautiful wife, Sarah. Then came the devastating breast cancer diagnosis. Sarah had fought bravely for 2 years before passing away, leaving Nissan entirely shattered. The aggressive treatments had drained their savings, forcing him to mortgage his business assets and rely on high-interest loans. He was drowning in medical debt, taking on grueling round-the-clock contracting jobs, just to keep a roof over Chloe's head. The Astor project was supposed to be his lifeline. But running on 3 hours of sleep, desperate to finish the phase ahead of schedule to secure his payout, Nissan had made a critical error. He had misread an updated blueprint addendum, directing his small crew to drill directly into a high-pressure aqueduct line. The resulting flood was an absolute nightmare. At 8 a.m., there was a sharp knock on the apartment door. Nissan opened it to find a stoic man in a windbreaker who shoved a thick manila envelope against his chest. "Nissan Wallace. You've been served." Nissan opened the documents on his kitchen counter, the cheap overhead light flickering above him. When his eyes finally landed on the bold, terrifying figure, $1 million, the air completely abandoned his lungs. Garcia Holdings was suing him for $1 million in personal damages. They were coming for his bank accounts, his work equipment, and the very apartment he and Chloe lived in. He had 48 hours to appear for a preliminary mediation. 2 days later, Nissan sat in the suffocatingly pristine conference room of Harrison and Gable Veronica's legal bulldog firm. He wore the only suit he owned, a charcoal two-piece he hadn't worn since Sarah's funeral. He felt entirely out of his depth, a solitary ghost, facing down a firing squad of corporate lawyers in $1,000 suits. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. The room immediately fell silent. Veronica Garcia walked in. She was a vision of absolute power, dressed in a tailored crimson blazer, her dark hair pulled into a severe, immaculate twist. She didn't look at the contractor immediately. She was too busy checking an email on her phone, while Richard pulled out her leather chair. "Let's make this quick, Richard. I have a board meeting in 40 minutes, she said, her voice a sharp, commanding alto. She finally looked up across the expanse of the glass table. Nissan froze. The breath rushed out of him as if he had been struck in the chest. Veronica's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the glass. The color completely drained from her flawless face, her meticulously crafted armor shattering in a fraction of a second. They stared at each other, the air in the room suddenly thick, charged, and utterly breathless. It had been 12 years. 12 years since Stanford University. 12 years since they had loved each other with a blinding, reckless intensity. And 12 years since Nissan Wallace had destroyed her heart. Veronica Taur. Nissan breathed his voice barely more than a ragged whisper. Richard Lawson looked back and forth between his billionaire client and the broken contractor, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Ms. Garcia, do you know the defendant?" For a moment, Veronica was transported back to a rainy night in Palo Alto. She felt the ghost of Nissan's hands, heard the devastating finality in his voice when he had packed his bags and walked out of her cramped dorm room, leaving her completely alone on the eve of launching her first company. He had told her she was too ambitious, too consumed by the pursuit of wealth, and that he couldn't spend his life in the shadow of a woman whose only master was ambition. It was a rejection so profound it had fundamentally altered her DNA, forging the ruthless CEO standing in the room today. Veronica swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as the ice rapidly reformed over her shock. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, searing fury. "I know of him," Veronica stated, her voice dropping an octave laced with pure venom. She slowly sat down, resting her manicured hands on the table. "Though I am surprised to see him sitting on that side of the table. Tell me, Mr. Wallace, how does one go from an Ivy League architecture program to gross negligence in a subterranean ditch?" Nissan flinched, the words landing like physical blows. "Veronica, please. If I had known Garcia Holdings was your company, you would have been more careful not to destroy $1 million of my property." She cut in, her eyes flashing. "Is that what you're saying? That my assets only warrant respect if you know they belong to me?" No, Nissan said, gripping the edge of the table. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake. But I am begging you to look at the reality of this situation. If you push this lawsuit through, I have absolutely nothing left. My commercial insurance policy was terminated because I missed 2 premium payments. That sounds like a personal management failure, not a legal defense, Richard interjected smoothly. Veronica held up a hand, silencing her lawyer. She leaned forward, her gaze locking onto Nissan's tired, desperate eyes. She noted the cheap suit, the grey in his hair, the deep lines etched around his mouth. A dark, twisted sense of vindication flared in her chest, warring with an agonizing pang of an emotion she refused to identify as sympathy. He had abandoned her for an easier life, for a woman he claimed could offer him the simple, quiet happiness Veronica couldn't. And this was where that choice had led him. You always did think the rules didn't apply to you, Nissan, Veronica said softly, though the words carried across the silent room. You made your choices 12 years ago. You wanted a simple life. Well, the simple truth of the business world is that actions have consequences. You caused $1 million in damage. You will pay for it. I don't have it. Nissan finally raised his voice, his composure cracking. I don't have $1 million, Veronica. I don't even have 10,000. If you take my business and my equipment, I can't work. If I can't work, we lose the apartment. I have a 7-year-old daughter. Please. The word hung in the air. Daughter. Veronica felt a sharp, unexpected pain in her ribs. He had a child. Of course he did. He had built the beautiful domestic family life he had thrown in her face all those years ago. And yet, he had the audacity to sit here and use that child as a shield to escape accountability. Then you should have thought about your daughter before you recklessly operated heavy machinery on a site you weren't qualified to handle, Veronica said, standing up abruptly. She couldn't breathe in this room anymore. She couldn't look at him. The settlement offer is $1 million payable in 30 days. If you cannot produce the funds, we will see you in court, Mr. Wallace. We are done here. She turned and walked out, the click of her heels echoing like gunshots down the hallway. That evening, the skies over Manhattan opened up, unleashing a torrential downpour. Veronica sat in the back of her chauffeured Maybach, staring out at the blurred neon lights of the city. Her chest felt tight, a suffocating pressure she hadn't experienced in over a decade. She pulled out her iPad to review her afternoon briefings, but all she could see were Nissan's haunted eyes. The car descended into the private, heavily guarded underground parking garage of Garcia Tower. The vehicle came to a smooth halt, and her driver opened the door. As Veronica stepped out, a figure stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. Her driver immediately reached for his radio, but Veronica held up a hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Nissan. He was completely soaked, his cheap coat clinging to his frame, rain dripping from his dark hair. "How did you get in here?" Veronica demanded, trying to keep her voice perfectly level. "I know the security layout of this building. I helped design the initial blueprints for the architectural firm that won the bid," Nissan said, taking a slow step forward. "I need 5 minutes, Veronica. Just 5 minutes without your lawyers." "We have nothing to say to each other," she replied, gripping her leather briefcase like a shield. "You need to leave before I have you arrested for trespassing." "Do it," he said, his voice cracking with raw desperation. "Arrest me, because going to jail tonight is better than going home and looking my little girl in the eyes and telling her we have nowhere to live." Veronica crossed her arms, trying to suppress the trembling in her hands. "Where is your wife, Nissan? Where is the woman you threw our entire future away for? Let her bail you out." Nissan closed his eyes, a profound, agonizing sorrow washing over his features. Sarah is dead, Veronica. She died 3 years ago from breast cancer. The medical bills wiped out everything I had, and the loans I took out to keep her alive took the rest. I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night in 3 years. I made a mistake on your site because I was exhausted trying to finish the job so I could buy Chloe a winter coat. The anger that had been sustaining Veronica suddenly faltered, threatening to collapse entirely. She stared at the man she had once loved more than life itself, realizing that the narrative she had held on to for 12 years, the image of him living a perfect, wealthy, happy life without her, was a complete illusion. He was drowning. "I am sorry for your loss, Nissan," Veronica said, her voice tight, fighting the tears burning the back of her eyes. "I truly am. But it doesn't change the facts. You walked away from me when things got hard. You told me my ambition was a sickness. Now you want me to waive $1 million loss out of the goodness of the heart you once told me I didn't possess." Nissan looked at her, his expression a mix of awe and profound regret. "You don't understand what happened 12 years ago, Veronica. You only know what I had to let you believe." "Don't do that," she snapped, her defenses rising aggressively. "Don't try to rewrite history to save your skin." "I will sign whatever you want," Nissan pleaded, ignoring her anger. He stepped closer, stepping into the harsh fluorescent light of the garage. "I will sign over the business. I will work for Garcia Holdings for free for the next 20 years. Garnish my wages, take my equipment. But please, Veronica, drop the personal liability suit. Don't take our home. Don't punish my daughter for my sins." Veronica looked at him for a long, agonizing moment. The rain beat heavily against the concrete ramp behind him. She wanted to forgive him. A small, buried part of her wanted to reach out and pull him inside out of the cold. But the scars he had left were too deep, and the empire she had built was entirely predicated on never showing weakness. "I don't punish people, Nissan," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I simply balance the ledger. I'll see you in court." She turned and walked to the private elevator, her spine perfectly straight. But as the steel doors closed, shutting out the sight of Nissan standing alone in the damp garage, Veronica Garcia finally let a single tear slip down her cheek. The trial was set for the following month. The collision course was locked, and neither of them realized that the courtroom would soon unearth a devastating secret that would destroy them both. Manhattan's Daniel Patrick Moynihan United States Courthouse felt colder than usual that Tuesday morning. Inside courtroom 21B, the air was entirely devoid of oxygen, replaced by a suffocating heavy tension that settled over the polished oak benches. At the plaintiff's table sat Veronica Garcia, draped in a flawless charcoal suit, her expression an impenetrable fortress of ice. Beside her, Richard Lawson was busy organizing a mountain of forensic financial documents, eager to secure a swift decapitation of the defendant. At the defense table, Nissan Wallace sat completely alone. He had no legal counsel, having been denied pro bono representation due to the complex commercial nature of the lawsuit. He looked smaller today, his broad shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of his impending ruin. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Judge Mitchell Kessler, a man infamous in the New York legal circuit for his uncompromising adherence to the letter of the law. Kessler was a veteran jurist, his face lined with decades of presiding over the city's most bitter corporate disputes. He was not a man easily swayed by emotion or theatrics. Court is now in session. Judge Kessler announced his gavel, striking the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. "Garcia Holdings versus Wallace. Mr. Lawson, you may proceed with your opening statement." Richard stood, buttoning his jacket with a confident smirk. He spent the next 20 minutes painting a picture of gross, almost criminal incompetence. He detailed how Nissan, operating on an expired insurance policy, had brazenly ignored the site blueprints and drilled directly into a primary high-pressure water main, causing massive subterranean flooding. "Your Honor," Richard concluded, leaning against the podium, "this is not a case of a simple mistake. This is a case of negligent endangerment and breach of contract. My client suffered a calculated loss of $1 million. We are simply asking the court to hold Mr. Wallace accountable for the devastation he caused." Veronica watched Nissan intently throughout Richard's speech. She expected him to object, to show anger, or at least to look her in the eye. Instead, he stared down at his scarred, calloused hands. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. "Mr. Wallace," Judge Kessler said, turning his piercing gaze to the solitary contractor. "The plaintiff has presented a very compelling argument. Do you have an opening statement, or would you like to move directly into presenting your defense?" Nissan slowly stood up. He didn't walk to the podium. He simply stood behind his table, looking up at the judge. "I don't have a legal team. Your Honor," Nissan began, his voice hoarse but surprisingly steady, "and I don't deny that I drove that drill bit into the water main. I flooded the Astor Heritage Project, but I did not do it out of negligence. I did it on purpose." A collective gasp echoed from the gallery. Richard Lawson immediately sat up, his eyes widening in shock. Even Veronica felt a sudden icy jolt in her stomach. He did it on purpose. This was worse than negligence. It was corporate sabotage. "Objection, Your Honor," Richard shouted, jumping to his feet. "The defendant has just admitted to intentional destruction of property. We move for an immediate summary judgment." "Overruled, Mr. Lawson." "Sit down," Judge Kessler snapped. He leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "Mr. Wallace admitting to intentional property damage is a bold strategy. You had better explain yourself, and it had better be good." Nissan reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. "Your Honor, prior to taking the contract with Garcia Holdings, I worked as a senior structural analyst. When my crew was excavating the subterranean levels of the Astor site, I noticed irregular stress fracturing along the foundation's primary load-bearing pillars." He walked forward, handing the envelope to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "I hired an independent engineer from Ove Arup and Partners using the last $3,000 I had to my name to run a ground-penetrating radar scan of the site during the night shift." Nissan continued, his voice echoing in the silent room. "The results are in that envelope. The 1920s cathedral isn't just settling. It is resting directly on top of an active, deteriorating subterranean sinkhole. The structural integrity is entirely compromised." Veronica felt the blood drain from her face. She turned to Richard, who looked equally horrified. If what Nissan was saying was true, the entire $500 million project was a death trap. "And why Mr. Wallace?" Judge Kessler asked carefully, breaking the seal on the envelope. "Did you not simply present this information to Garcia Holdings? Why flood the site?" Nissan finally turned to look at Veronica. The sheer, unadulterated sorrow in his eyes pinned her to her chair. "Because I checked the public records, Your Honor," Nissan said softly. "The original geological surveys submitted to the City Planning Commission to secure the building permits were falsified. They were signed off 12 years ago by Arthur Garcia, the former CEO and Veronica's late father." The courtroom erupted into frantic whispers. The gavel slammed down repeatedly until silence was restored. "If I had brought the report to the board," Nissan explained, his voice breaking slightly, "they would have buried it to protect the company's stock price, just like Arthur Garcia did. They would have fired me, sealed the foundation, and continued building. Within 2 years of opening, that building would have collapsed. Thousands of people would have died." Nissan took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Flooding the site was the only way. It triggered an automatic EPA review and a mandatory structural halt. I destroyed the electrical grid so they couldn't pour the concrete over the sinkhole. I ruined my life to stop a massacre. Judge Kessler was completely silent. He was reading through the stamped verified Ove Arup engineering report. The lines on his face seemed to deepen, a profound sorrow washing over his stern features. 30 years ago, Judge Kessler had lost his own sister in a catastrophic building collapse in Queens, a tragedy caused by the exact same kind of corporate negligence. The judge slowly lowered the documents. When he looked up at Nissan, his eyes were shining with unshed tears. His hands resting on the mahogany desk were visibly trembling. "Mr. Lawson." Judge Kessler whispered, his voice thick with an emotion no one in the courtroom had ever heard from him before. He cleared his throat, struggling to maintain his judicial composure. "Are you aware of the contents of this engineering report?" Richard stood up, his confidence entirely evaporated. "No, Your Honor. Garcia Holdings had no knowledge of any falsified geological surveys." "Then I suggest you advise your client to drop this lawsuit immediately," Judge Kessler said, his voice hardening into steel. "Because if this goes to a full trial, not only will this court find Mr. Wallace completely innocent under the doctrine of public necessity, but I will personally recommend a federal investigation into Garcia Holdings for criminal fraud and reckless endangerment." Veronica sat frozen, her entire world tilting on its axis. Her father had lied. Her mentor, the man who had taught her everything about business, had been willing to risk thousands of lives for a profit margin. And Nissan, the man she had hated for over a decade, the man she was currently trying to destroy, had thrown himself onto the grenade to stop it. He had saved her. If the building had collapsed under her tenure as CEO, the criminal liability would have fallen squarely on her shoulders. She would have gone to federal prison. "Withdraw the suit, Richard," Veronica commanded, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the courtroom. "Veronica, wait, we need to assess the corporate liability," Richard started. "I said withdraw the damn suit," she yelled, standing up, tears finally breaking free and streaming down her flawless cheeks. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor, Garcia, Holdings drops all charges and claims against Mr. Wallace with prejudice." Judge Kessler nodded slowly, wiping a stray tear from his cheek with the back of his hand. "Case dismissed. And Mr. Wallace." Nissan looked up, exhaustion radiating from every pore of his body. "The city of New York owes you a debt it can never repay," the judge said softly. "You are a good man. Court is adjourned." As the gallery cleared and the lawyers scrambled out of the room, Veronica bypassed her legal team and walked directly over to the defense table. Nissan was packing his empty briefcase, his hands shaking. "Nissan," Veronica whispered. He stopped, looking up at her. "You have your company, Veronica. You have your legacy. The EPA will fix the sinkhole. Just please, let me go home to my daughter." 12 years ago, Veronica said, her voice trembling, demanding the truth she had been denied. "Why did you really leave me?" Nissan closed his eyes, a pained sigh escaping his lips. "Because your father found out about us. He came to my dorm room. He told me that you were destined to take over the empire, and that a broke architecture student would only drag you down. I told him I didn't care. I told him I loved you." He opened his eyes, meeting her tear-filled gaze. "Then he handed me a dossier. It contained irrefutable proof that my father had been embezzling money from his employer to pay for his gambling debts. Your father owned the company my dad stole from. He told me that if I didn't break your heart and walk away forever, he would press charges. My father would have died in prison, Veronica." Veronica gasped, covering her mouth with her hands, as a sob ripped from her throat. Her father hadn't just manipulated the business. He had systematically destroyed the only real love she had ever known. Nissan hadn't abandoned her out of a lack of ambition. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own heart to protect his family, and he had spent the last 12 years carrying the burden of her hatred in silence. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, stepping forward and closing the distance between them. She reached out her trembling fingers, gently touching his rough cheek. "Nissan, I am so completely sorry." He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, the exhaustion of 12 long, bitter years finally breaking. "I never stopped loving you, Vic. Not for a single day." In the empty, echoing courtroom, the billionaire CEO and the broke single father finally collapsed into each other's arms, holding on as if letting go would mean the end of the world. 3 months later, the Astor Heritage Project was completely redesigned under the strict supervision of Garcia Holdings' new lead structural engineer, Nissan Wallace. The corporate corruption of Arthur Garcia was purged from the company's legacy, replaced by a new era of transparency and integrity. Veronica didn't just drop the lawsuit, she dismantled the walls around her own heart. She stepped into the role she had been missing her entire life, not just as a visionary CEO, but as a partner to Nissan and a devoted, loving mother figure to little Chloe. Sometimes the greatest investments we make aren't measured in dollars and cents. They are measured in the grace we offer others, the truths we are brave enough to unearth, and the love we are willing to rebuild from the ruins of our past. If you felt the power of truth and second chances in this story, don't keep it to yourself. Smash that like button, share this incredible journey of redemption with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramatic stories that touch the heart. Let us know in the comments if you think true love can survive anything.